Welcome to today's program. My name is Katie Fleming and I'm the education coordinator at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology. And I'm really delighted to be here today to welcome you all to today's conversation with artist and professor Stephanie Syjuco. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone.
And before our program begins, I'm going to take a moment to share a land acknowledgement and to go over some Zoom functions as well as our program format today and give you a little bit of background on how this all came into being. So firstly, we take a moment to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Here at the Hearst, we're working to recognize and grapple with our own specific origins and role within the university. Even before we existed as a museum, our collections began with projects that participated in and were made possible by campaigns of genocide waged against Native Californian people, ancestors whose descendants are still here alive with us today. As a museum, we want to acknowledge the pain our institution has caused and work to offer a meaningful apology. We aim to create new kinds of collaborative relationships in the present and future, which will affirm Indigenous sovereignty and hold ourselves accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. We want to offer an apology by transforming the museum into a site for social justice, inclusion, anti-racist action, and Indigenous knowledge production. For those of you who have been using Zoom a lot, you probably know all this already, so thanks for your patience. But for those who haven't, I'm just going to go over some Zoom features for us today. You'll be able to change your audio settings in your screen view using the buttons at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on which device you're on today. We're going to have the public chat turned off for the beginning portion of today's talk, and we're going to turn it on later and open it up kind of for more broad conversation. But if you have a question that you know you're going to want to ask during the Q&A portion of today's talk, feel free to send it as a chat message directly to me. So just select my name, Katie Fleming, from the drop-down menu, and you can send that message my way, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the latter part of the program. So a little bit of background on how today's program came into being. We've been having conversations about the Hearst Museum's current exhibit entitled Cloth That Stretches, Weaving Community Across Time and Space, which seeks to explore the ways in which textiles and clothing have operated as sites for cultural resilience and resistance over time. I'll drop a link in the chat a little bit later on to that, that exhibit if you're curious. And then backing up a little further, since 1960, the Hearst Museum, the Department of Anthropology, and the Department of Art Practice have shared physical space in the same building, formerly known as Kroeber Hall, now the Anthropology and Art Practice Building after its recent unnaming earlier this year. And despite the fact that these units have existed in close physical proximity to one another, clear lines have been drawn between the disciplines of anthropology and art, between the ways art and anthropology museums have built their collections, and between the ways museum goers understand these collections and locate themselves in different types of museums and spaces. Thinking about all those things, I'm delighted today to introduce Stephanie Syjuco, who's a professor in the Department of Art Practice at UC Berkeley and an artist whose work blurs the lines between anthropology, art, installation, performance, archival investigation, and social commentary, and so much more. And today, Stephanie's going to be focusing first on two recent projects, The Visible Invisible and Cargo Cults, that demonstrate the ways in which textiles reveal the fabricated nature of our history. And then we'll dive into a discussion more broadly about the relationships between artists, archives, and museums in the hopes of identifying opportunities for these collections to be repurposed as catalysts for positive change and social justice. And I really hope that this is going to be a vibrant conversation today. We welcome your questions and your commentary. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Stephanie, to walk us through some of your recent work.
Great, wonderful. Katie, thank you so much for the introduction and also the opportunity to kind of talk together about our disciplines because, interestingly enough, I've been at Berkeley now for about 8 years, but the connections between the art practice department and anthropology are, I would say, they're newish in the sense that, because of our now shared building that is literally named after both our disciplines, I feel like it actually puts us on an interesting equal level. So anyway, thanks for having me. And I guess as an introduction, I just want to say that I'll be, again, sharing two projects. They're not super recent since I have a exhibition currently up right now of mostly photography, but I am going to focus on textile-based works. So Katie, yeah, if you could go ahead and start sharing, we'll dive right into it. And I'm going to go pretty quickly, actually, just because I'd like to make sure that we have time at the end for our discussion. So, a project that I think kind of makes sense in terms of thinking about the anthropologic gaze and also drawing in histories of ethnographic photography. A project, a photographic work that I did, a series of photos back in 2016. It was part of a series called Cargo Cults. And in them, I was posing myself as a kind of fictionalized native Filipino. And being inspired by looking at 100-plus-year-old photographs of Filipinos taken by both European as well as American colonialists, essentially. I was creating these very fictional kind of reinterpretations of some of these images, both to kind of critically engage with it, but also to expose the nature of these images, the original images, total staging. So if you first look at the image, it's this very vibrant, kind of black and white graphic photo. But on closer inspection, if you look really close at the image, you'll start to notice some very odd things. So what I was doing was creating these photos by using mass manufactured clothes from shopping malls and stores such as The Gap, Banana Republic, Forever 21, H&M, American Apparel, et cetera, buying them on with my credit card, taking them back to my studio and styling them in such a way that it did elicit this kind of, ethnographic image. And then after the photo shoots, returning all the clothes back to the stores for full store credit. So, it was the creation of the images in this playful manner, but also this kind of refusal, to both consume the image or consume the objects made in it and, kind of push them back after I was done with them. So if you look very closely, I mean, I can dissect a lot of things here. That's an Urban Outfitters shopping bag on my head, a sock from Target around my neck. You can also see price tags because I had to leave all the price tags on the objects in order to, get the store credit afterwards. So moving forward, let's take a look at some of the next ones. It was a series of 4 images total. And, again, this was thinking about the many different depictions of the very different and varied tribes in the Philippines. The Philippines itself is this really large collection of islands with lots of different cultures and peoples. And they were brought together by the Spanish in an attempt to kind of create a single nation out of them. So I was attempting to depict this sort of the diversity, but also, play out the exotification of these individuals. So Basket Woman, I think that's a trash can that I'm holding from Target. And, lots of, you can see the price tags on some of the other objects. And go ahead and move to the next image. Java Bunny, which also, kind of played on another notion of ethnographic depictions. I had a lot of fun actually in the studio composing these because a lot of the ethnographic photographs I was looking at were quite composed. You could tell the way that they were asking the sitter to kind of hold themselves, or even the amplification of their accessories or clothes that they were wearing. So on top of my head here is a cheerleading pom-pom, a black cheerleading pom-pom, belts from The Gap around my neck, I think a USB cord from Radio Shack, and all the backdrop behind me, all the everything I was using as backdrops were both fabrics purchased from Joann Fabrics, which is a kind of standard mall craft store, as well as black and white laserjet printouts of images I was downloading from the internet. So next image. And every now and then too, you would see these kinds of interruptions of grayscale color charts, because I was also interested in how photography itself has a kind of visual language of calibration, of like what makes a good image, or what you're supposed to compare an image alongside in terms of, you know, proper exposure or proper color. And so in this case, you know, the calibration chart is directly in the middle of the image. And the reason for the graphic, really kind of vibrant black and white quality too, was to actually sort of disrupt the viewer's ability to potentially see the figure clearly. I wanted it to be almost distracting in its way of not showing something very obviously. Next image. Okay, so, you know, I did that project now about 5 years ago, and I think that the fascinating thing about that was, for me, it was a critique of, you know, the kind of gaze of empire. But a lot of, I think that critique was actually kind of lost on people, which was really interesting. I had people wonder who you know, what real tribes people these were supposed to be, or, you know, there was a lot of assumptions that this might actually have been a real in terms of culture. So I began to think a little bit more also on how we construct and fabricate other forms of histories attached to garments. And in thinking specifically about American history, in the sense of, you know, this land that we're currently on, reenactment garments, and specifically, you know, from, say, the Civil War era. Obviously, Civil War reenactments are still a huge popular event in the United States, and I find that fascinating because, you know, it's what is this thing that we want to try to keep reliving. And what you're seeing on the left are a number of sewing patterns, commercial sewing patterns of both theatrical costumes of different time periods in American history, as well as also reenactment costumes. And so next image, please. And so I kind of think of this work as a sort of bookend to cargo cults. This project is called The Visible Invisible, and it's handmade garments dating from different time periods of American history that were considered pivotal to the country's formation. But everything is hand sewn by myself out of green screen chroma key backdrop fabric. And so if you know, green chroma key is this very bright green color that's used usually in a fabric backdrop during a digital video shoot, in which then you can swap out that green color for almost any image in the background. So it's a kind of digital manipulation, or it's a way of transposing other meaning onto a scene. And so the three images, or the three garments that I decided to recreate, were, for me, these iconic historical time periods of the US. So, you know, the Plymouth Pilgrim, in terms of the founding of the nation's history. The colonial revolution, you know, in which the country separated officially from Britain, and then became its own country. And then also the front dress that represents the kind of the beauty and grandeur of the antebellum South. And so for me, all these, you know, the history of these garments and the beauty of them, they also act as a kind of a projection screen, really, you know, for the kinds of narratives that we keep iterating about the history of the United States, and that history is actually highly manipulable, and it's told from the viewpoints of those that are not always representative of everyone who participated. So let's go to the next image. I was lucky to have these works actually at the Smithsonian Museum. So they were part of the craft galleries called the Renwick Gallery. And I made it a point to hand learn 19th century ribbon embroidery techniques, as well as crochet lace, because I really wanted to have this very deep sense of also fabricating from scratch these objects. Keep going. And so this is a detail of the bonnet. I learned bonnet making, and the details of, you know, ribbon flowers. And It's the exact opposite in a sense of what I was doing with cargo cults, in which, you know, mass manufactured objects were, you know, brought into the work. This I wanted to be responsible for fully, because I wanted a hand in fabricating the American history. Keep going. And the Plymouth Pilgrim. So next image. Yeah, just some details. And then next image. And so I guess I'm going to also just close out this portion of my work by acknowledging that I have an exhibition up right now at Catherine Clark Gallery, and it's work produced during a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship that I was able to complete right before COVID. The exhibition's up right now, and it's based on imagery and of archival excavations of the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., as well as the anthropology collection, the Smithsonian Anthropology Collection. So I was searching for visual depictions of the Philippines and American Empire in the Philippines. And in many cases, what I was finding were huge omissions or gaps, or even mistakes in the archives. And keep going, next image. And so, you know, thinking about also archival visualities of like stacks of papers and layers of photographs, I was trying to simulate what it looks like to attempt to find oneself or evidence of one's history within the American Empire's archives. Keep going. And I was also intervening in them. So I have a tendency, you know, when I'm sitting in an archive or a museum collection, there's very little that can be done to say, narrate on top of it sometimes, or to remove an object, or to even change it. And so I was doing these very quick and temporary interventions with my camera, sometimes laying things over, blocking the way an image could be seen, or creating a kind of commentary based on my ability to temporarily be in the archive. Keep going. And then another related series too is like blocking the act of looking at some of these ethnographic photos. Because, you know, the ability to consume those images so easily is actually quite problematic, in the sense that although we can maybe say we're quote unquote farther along, you know, than the time period in which we were making these images, these quite, you know, in a sense, like quite exoticized or racist images of America's new colony, the Philippines, back in, you know, 1904. I still think our ability to look at these images can still be quite problematic. So I've been working on a series of crumpled and interrupted visions. Keep going. And then also a video series in which I'm physically blocking with my hands the ability to see some of the quote unquote natives on display. Next one. And then I think I'm ending with a couple images of what it looks like to do this work in the archive. Even though I get sometimes what can be considered special access, it's really not that special. Like I'm basically, you know, I have tables set up just like a normal researcher. I get to set up a camera, but I don't get to bring in special equipment or ask for a lot of special favors. And so I think, you know, the limitations of the museum and archive also come into play sometimes in how an artist can interact with the work. Next shot. And through my kind of collecting process of images, I wind up amassing, you know, thousands of different images, whether they're downloaded from an archive or actually physically rephotographed in the space itself. And then, so this is a shot of, say, you know, a sample collection of images. And then from there, I kind of consider how to remix or rework them in order to, you know, bring forward maybe some of the hidden narratives. And I think that's the last image. So yeah, Katie, let's take it back so we can have a conversation.
Yeah, and I'm actually really glad that you ended with these conversations about how a lot of this work has taken you into archives and behind the scenes in museums. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that experience has felt like for you. For people that haven't had the opportunity to get behind the scenes at a museum or visit an archive themselves, it actually was a surprise to me that you could take as many photographs of these photographs that were in archives, because often there are even such strict rules around access in that sense. So can you describe some of these spaces that you've been in, talk about your experience being in them as an artist? And yeah, I'd love to have that as a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it depends on the museum, right? The Smithsonian itself, it's huge, but they do devote a lot of staff to assisting researchers. And so if you've got access or entry, you can call forward files. They come in boxes. You open things up. Sometimes it's not what you were expecting at all. Like the description was imperfect. And then the reason I'm able to set up a camera there is because I guess for just general researchers, photographing documents versus like Xeroxing them has become a really easy thing. But what I've noticed though is the archivists they don't really understand necessarily what I'm doing. So I'm sitting there doing these things and she must be compiling these images for a research paper. Because what they're mostly familiar with are people doing research for academic, papers and journals, but not sort of visual intervention. And then the other beautiful thing I've found out, and you could never do this remotely or online or through a digital archive, the things that are written on the reverse of documents, or the things in file folders that were not considered important enough to be photographed, are actually the more interesting things. And so I found that, having time in the archive, I'm able to look at the margins of it as opposed to what is supposedly presented.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of brings us back to a lot of the themes that carry through your work in terms of the boundaries of the lens that we get to see history through, whether it's authorship, being limited to a certain subset of people in positions of power, or what is it just that by happenstance makes it into the archives and stands the test of time. And I know that to be true, having worked in and out of collections at the Hearst Museum for many years, is that that's definitely the case, that there's so much content handwritten on the fronts and backs of catalog cards, notes physically attached to objects that are really revealing not so much necessarily about the authentic information about the piece that you're looking at, but very revealing about the mindset of the collectors, about the worldview of the people working in these institutions 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and that can be a really robust area of information that people haven't maybe explored. So it's great to see you doing work with that. That kind of brings me to a question about some of the titles of your work. So we chose to title this talk "The Visible Invisible," and that's also the title of your work from a few years back. Lately, museums and people in the field of anthropology have been working to pull back the curtain or be more transparent about authorship of and bias in research and exhibits and collecting. And you do a lot of this in your work in the way that you reveal very visibly and upfront the constructed nature of things that many people don't necessarily see or think about. Can you talk a little bit more about the theme of that in your work? And I'm really curious to hear anything else you can share about the kind of unexpected impact of cargo cults that you kind of mentioned, of that message not actually getting across, or people kind of having a very surface level experience with your work.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's quite obvious. So, as a Filipino American, as a woman of color, when I go into these archives, it's very obvious, like the standpoint from which the collections arose. It's like there's that the authorship of who's doing the collecting, whose voices are in there. It's very one directional. It's always of looking at the subjects as opposed to the subjects in any way being able to articulate anything beyond being looked at. And it's actually, I mean, I knew that I guess academically and also logically, but after spending months, just seeing it over and over and over and over again, it's really clear that, we have these giant, massive archives and collections that if we still value them in the sense that they're still speaking today, that researchers go to them, that, they're in use all the time, what's missing isn't just I guess, this abstract notion of representation, but it's what's missing is like the entire the much larger picture of what can be said now, because I think so if I'm being called in to do some sort of like quote unquote remedial work, you know, it doesn't change the archive. And that's, I think, what's kind of ironic, right? It's like my ability to say comment on it or create contemporary artwork on it doesn't change the archive. The archive is there. It's still there. And so I guess the challenge is like either to add to the collection, obviously, in really meaningful ways, or to create more interesting pathways that give a different agency to accessing it. But part two of your question also was what were some of the problematics of cargo cults? And I think the problematics, it turns out, what I thought was a critique, actually a critique of, say, the ethnographic gaze and looking at these fake tribal peoples, was actually not effective in going against a very, very strong innate desire for the public to want to see those images. It's very difficult to fight, ethnographic photography because people think they're beautiful, and a lot of the times they were staged to be that way, and they're seen as these kinds of very cultural, it's real, it's culturally real. And then the irony also is that a lot of peoples who have had their histories removed from them have to turn to these archives to relearn and regain knowledge that was lost to them. And so it's super problematic. And so I will never do a project like that again. Not because I don't like it personally, but because I couldn't, the field of ethnographic photography has too much of a hold on the public imagination.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. I'm curious, what was the context in which they were exhibited, or has this spanned anywhere that they've been seen?
Yeah, well, multiple places. So I think sometimes you're right. That's a good point. The context is everything. So, they've been in larger solo exhibitions in which, for my work, where, they've been in juxtaposition with other things that are discussing empire. They were at the Museum of Modern Art in a contemporary photography art show in New York a number of years ago. But still, the images circulate without me.
Yeah.
Really weird. So when they go through the internet, it's really weird to see what people say of them and think of them and still assume of them.
Yeah, that's really important to think about. And and the Hearst certainly has significant collections of ethnographic photography in very much the realm that this work was inspired by, including some images by Edward Curtis, who's maybe one of the most famous for staging these photos. Paintings that also are staged in the same way, including a number by Carolyn Meitinger, who traveled around Oceania with the intention of creating anthropological paintings to be sold back to museums, which were entirely staged, often without much thought given or intentional thought given to people wearing things that weren't actually appropriate to their cultural background or identity. It reminds me too of a show I saw not long ago, last fall, at the Berkeley Art Center, which included works manipulating ethnographic photography to reverse some of the stoic looks that were on the faces of Native women Native North American women that were depicted in these images, and giving them smiles. And as a kind of that this depiction of the past as stoic and authentic and beautiful is so entirely fabricated. I'll pull up the link to that show, and also wanted to call out that you have a work at the Berkeley Art Center now as well, which also talks again about the interplay between museums and collections held in different places. I wanted to kind of ask another question about cargo cults and talk a little bit about your use in this work of calibration charts and color checkers, also in your work in Native Resolution at the Catherine Clark Gallery. For me, they really signaled a connection to the ways in which anthropology has been leveraged both as a soft and hard science, particularly around racial and cultural categorization, at the same time kind of being able to slip between these categories, veiling itself as a scientific objective field, but then pulling back and saying, well, it's it has an authorship and bias. And can you talk more about if that was any thought you had given into the use of these charts or how they function in the work for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I started off from thinking about, the photographic, the construct of a photograph, right? So in terms of thinking about studio photography, there's, lighting kits, there's all sorts of ways in which one is supposed to make a really great photo. And the calibration charts that you see, usually they're these, color grids that are held next to the subject. And then it helps to kind of, make sure that the skin tone is correct or that you have the light values correct. And so they pop up everywhere. They pop up as a kind of almost like a regimenting force. It's sort of like, is the subject correct? Is it right? Do we have it? Do we, and I, especially in museum collections, like anthropology or even fine art, you always see those little color strips or measuring strips or everything. And of course, they function in order to kind of create scale and, to make sure that you've, captured the image accurately. But it does definitely feel like this overlay of, the calibration chart itself is as much of a subject in those photographs as the thing that's being photographed. And it's really, they're very fascinating.
And another kind of topic I wanted to delve into was that both in Cargo Cults and in your current show, I was reminded of the similarities between photography and weaponry, both in the metaphors that we use, shooting someone, and in the physical resemblance of their equipment, bags, like the camera tripod doesn't look a lot different from like a rifle tripod. And in your installation at the Catherine Clark Gallery, the slideshow that you have there, the video piece that you have is paired with these quite loud and violent sounds of photographs being taken, film being advanced. And in a recent program that we had at the Hearst, which you can watch online, I'll drop a link in the chat later on, the author Dan Hicks talked about the ways museum collecting, military expeditions and photojournalism and documentation often went explicitly hand in hand, with anthropologists and military captains and leaders working alongside one another to disarm indigenous communities or engage in punitive expeditions that involved the physical attacks on people, but also cultural attacks on people, with the cultural objects and weapons being removed and stolen, and the resulting loot ending up in museum collections, including in the Hearst Museum. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned in a previous conversation we had that you've come across some of this in your work at the Smithsonian, and your kind of experience with this parallel of the violence of photography and collecting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, specifically to American history, photography as a discipline kind of, became much more populist and accessible, right after the late 1800s, and so early 1900s. And that was also the advent of kind of American empire overseas. And so, the U.S.'s acquisition of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines from Spain was completely documented through the photographers who were sent out with the military expeditions. And so, along with this kind of new way of showing things, it turned into souvenirs and, images that could be dispersed much more quickly. And it's fascinating how the evidence kind of like grows exponentially. And the way photography is used in the American context in the Philippines was as a way to also educate the American public as to their new wards. These are the peoples now that we must civilize. And they chose the photographs that would appear the most savage. And it's definitely went hand in hand with the kind of military and post-educational reformation of the Philippines in the shadow and the mirror of American culture.
Yeah. It just calls to mind so many of the photographs that that you see, both the interesting paradox between the beautiful ethnographic portraiture and the intentionally savage documentary photography that went on.
Yeah, and the language is really very. You're right. The language of photography is incredibly loaded.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
shooting.
literally you load film in a camera.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like the term native resolution, which is the title of my show at Catherine Clark, is actually a term used for digital imaging. And so native resolution of an image is the kind of like the amount of pixels in that. And yet it also has, like these wildly adjacent potentials for what that could be describing.
Yeah. We haven't talked so much yet about the visible and invisible, so I want to kind of return our conversation there, and also remind everyone that if you're interested in asking a question, feel free to choose my name from the drop-down menu to send a question my way, and we'll open it up in just a couple minutes to the kind of general Q&A. But I was really excited by the visible and invisible and seeing these really elaborate textiles that you had put together and handmade, and was reminded of some of the collections at the Hearst Museum that came to the Hearst by way of the home economics department, which later turned into the decorative arts department, and then the design department at UC Berkeley, and ultimately was dissolved in the mid-70s. And the Hearst Museum became the repository for all those collections. And, the field of anthropology, like you've mentioned so far, anthropologists were not collecting close to home, or if they were collecting from people that were othered from themselves. And the design department, in some ways, was also collecting in that realm, but also was collecting historic European American clothing, furniture, shoes, and so the insertion of this collection into the Hearst Museum's collection kind of created this filled this gap that had been there, which is a really interesting thing to me. And I guess I'm trying to kind of get to a question about the function of how we can imagine these collections as functional in new ways now. You talk about kind of your experience being able to learn some of these techniques from the collections themselves, the ways that Indigenous people around the world are often having no other option other than to turn to museum collections to find this information. What kind of potential do you see for opportunity in reimagining collections as teaching tools for the self, or more broadly for collections moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that is sort of like the education departments are tasked with these huge, goals, right? Because, opening it up, trying to kind of, get different voices in. And I guess we talked about this a little earlier too, which is that, for a number of years now, artists have been sort of turned to, to kind of invite into collections, because it's we can have a different viewpoint, but we don't have to structurally change things. And I get the expediency of that, that it is, if one needs to kind of create sort of new visions, but not have to vet it in a really, lengthy manner, it's good to, have that done. But it's also, I think, kind of curious, because it's just one part. Having artists do these projects is just really kind of one part of it, right? And I always appreciate when museums understand that, and then they start changing either their curatorial staff, or or even devoting more funds to enlarging the collection based on the holes. And so, specifically at the Smithsonian Museum, it's really heartening that they have, one of their first Filipino American curators in the American Museum that's looking specifically at Asian and Asian American representation, because there hadn't been one before. And I mean, that's kind of amazing. I mean, this was just a couple of years ago. So it's, maybe it's this multifaceted arena, right? It's but there is this it's a thing, right, to get artists to do this. And I appreciate that, but it's also I always want to see like the follow up or the follow through.
Yeah, and I think like in any realm that really needs changing, it can't just happen in one place. It can't just happen in the interpretation of the collections. It also needs to happen in the institutional procedures and in the representation on the staff and in the, in every aspect of it. So I appreciate you saying that and recognizing that artistic intervention is really only one tiny piece of what this change needs to look like. We're getting some questions from the audience now that I wanted to bring in. I recognize I also said I was going to drop some links in the chat. So I'm going to do some of that now and also read some questions here. The first question comes from an audience member who said, cargo cults reminds me of Seydou Keita's work. And this person's wondering how gender plays in these images, and that the photography and the handmade dresses and clothing seem to be very female or feminine. Can you talk about gender in some of your work?
Sure, yeah. Well, first to say yes. So Seydou Keita is definitely a touchstone. And I mean, the interesting thing too about Keita's work is that they were studio shots, and they were also highly composed, by the individuals who, helped choose what they were to wear, as well as Seydou's his kind of overarching visuality, which was this very, graphic black and white. So I did want to reference that work because there was agency in those photos. Like those images were self-created as opposed to taken by an ethnologist or an ethnographer. So, but then in terms of the genderedness of it. So I guess I was just starting from the place too of sort of like the female body as being usually like a sign of like cultural repository. I mean, there's, whether it's like, the nation, being depicted by, say, female figures a lot of times, if that's, a kind of iconic thing, also is out of convenience. So I didn't want to subject anyone else to have to deal with these sometimes outlandish get-ups. And it was just myself in the studio able to play, and in some, you can't really see them in all photos, but in some of them you can see that I'm holding the trigger, the camera trigger. So, there is that kind of self-referentiality there, but they're not autobiographical. And that's the other thing. Some people think that somehow it's me trying to get in touch with my culture. And it's like, no, this whole thing is made up.
Yeah, we also had another question about cargo cults, which was, did you think about keeping a question about kind of like what you did with the store credit if you ended up with all of that, or were you able to actually get refunded for everything? And the question actually comes from someone within our museum who's interested, because museums have often used receipts to demonstrate that the collections were acquired by free and just sale rather than being looted or sold under duress. Which of course, power dynamics exist in sale, of course. So yeah, just curious about like, and then what?
Oh yeah, well, a couple things I accidentally held longer than their 90 days. So I accidentally bought a lot of things that I just would never wear in real life. Yeah, no, it was really satisfying to spend, $1,000 and then just get it all back after the production of these things, or most of it. But yeah, for me, that was sort of like the backstory too, right? Like tying in notions also of consumption, both in terms of consumption of the image, but also the kind of like the capital, the accumulation of a capital that usually happens around these types of images. Like these images are highly valuable, like they sell for a lot, they are worth a lot in collections, and they have capital attached to it.
Yeah, the other thing that those images reminded me of is that, the Hearst has had a number of programs over the course of this exhibit over the past year that we we've talked explicitly about the garment industry. Particularly, we had a number of programs about the garment industry in South Asia, and the ways in which it's overtaken traditional textile practices and become the main opportunity oftentimes for women to find work in some regions. And the irony that in some cases, factory workers are ending up producing mass market products that replicate the culturally specific motifs and styles that originated but have no payments made to there is no ownership or copyright over these motifs, that then get hugely marketed by these massive companies. So yeah, happy to go down a road about talking about the kind of blurry lines between inspiration and appropriation, if that brings up anything for you, or we have some kind of more audience questions.
Yeah, no, well, so around when I was making this, so I did them in 2016, and I was on a residency, or sorry, I did it a little earlier than that actually, but I was on a residency program in Omaha, Nebraska when I made these images. And so there was something kind of ironic to me too about being in the middle of America, making these highly faux exotic things from imported goods, usually made in overseas factories by Asian laborers. I mean, there's something really messed up in that. And at the time too, what was it like? Ethnic patterning, black and white ethnic patterning was incredibly popular on these garments. So faux Aztec, or anything that kind of looked ethnic or zigzaggy or whatever, it was all there. And they were these like pastiches of actual, textile patterns. And so it was, it was a way of trying to be playful, but also, hopefully have a kind of criticality embedded in it as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about too the ways that museum collections have and haven't been used over time as inspiration for artists. I can share later an article with folks who are interested written by our research anthropologist from the Hearst Museum about the history of the design department's collections as explicitly for artistic inspiration, and the ways that these collections were made as kind of like just jumping off points for artistic inspiration or for inspiration in design of textiles, and how that has kind of morphed into this just like, yeah, like you said, a pastiche of just made up patterning that came from somewhere, but it's hard to pinpoint where. We have a couple more questions, kind of pivoting back to now the visible and invisible, some questions about your specific use of materials, wondering how you came to the use of black and white or chroma green as monochrome in your work, and what was your approach to the use of these materials. And another question too about whether you experimented with video projections on the surface because you used that green screen material, if that was a part of the idea behind it. So just talking about materials in that project.
Yeah. So the first part, or the first question, which kind of was asking about like the color, the choices of color palette, or the kind of significance of those, the colors. So it actually ties into, I've also done other series in which I use what is considered photographic neutral gray. And so photo neutral gray is, it's very specific in terms of, again, getting a kind of like perfect color for a photo. By choosing though, say chroma key green, which again, it's a green color that is incredibly vibrant. It's like, it's so in your face, and yet it's supposed to go away. It's a placeholder for something else. And when I was using that on, the American historical garments, it really was about this notion too, that we have completely fabricated very convenient narratives of American history. And so I was kind of using that as like the symbolic invisibility of what should be highly visible. So again, the title is The Visible Invisible. And actually it's about whiteness. It's about white supremacy. And, if we really went into it too, that kind of overlay of both whiteness in terms of the gaze and also white supremacy, it's invisible and highly visible at the same time. It's the sub what is it? It's just below the surface of everything. And so by creating that kind of monochrome, I know that, for some people that's a little bit of a stretch, and that's not necessarily the immediate thing that one can go to. But I was hoping at least that the chroma key greenness of it was a kind of red flag, if you should say, to that something's not quite right. And then, yeah, the graphic black and whiteness of the earlier photos was really, again, just a way to kind of create a visual disruption to what one thought they were seeing.
Yeah, it's really helpful that you said, I really like the way you phrased the kind of highly visible nature of this fabrication while at the same time being invisible. And I think it brings to mind for me, like, who is it invisible for? Like for people of color in this country and around the world, it's not invisible. It's highly visible in everything that exists. And so switching the narrative there to have the reverse, which is happening in so many different realms, I hope for a lot of people right now, of making visible the authorship and the fabricated nature of history, and that we're really only getting one version that comes from this power imbalance that's existed in our country and the world for hundreds of years at least, is a really important one to think about. We only have a few more minutes, so I wanted to kind of end in thinking about what's next for the relationships between museums and artists and communities, and whether there's any kind of like notes of optimism that you find in people's reactions to your own work, other projects that are going on that you've heard about that you're really excited about, things you're working on now, to kind of broaden the perspective of how we might imagine museums operating and archives operating in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think what's been interesting is, so, my original excursions into the archives was through this kind of a specific lens of looking at Filipinos and Filipino Americans in the Smithsonian National Archive. That was kind of like my project, because I was using that as a kind of template, really. Like, what does a colonized country look like through the eyes of the empire? It really almost could have been any colonized entity, but I chose the Philippines because I thought I had I have a connection to it and a kind of working knowledge of recognizing images. But I think also what I'm really excited about, so I'm also now moving my lens not just into just sort of Asian American or Filipino specific topics, but I'm going to be working on a project with an American museum in Fort Worth called the Amon Carter Museum of American History, and we're doing, or American art, and I'm going to be investigating with their conservation team notions of object damage, because again, like, taking it out of the culturally specific realm, but thinking about how damage on objects and exists within a collection and what that could possibly say about an American collection. And what I guess I'm going to highlight that too, just by saying that I think it would be short-sighted for museums to only expect that artists of certain backgrounds can only speak to those backgrounds in their collections. In other words, like, say, if someone wants to needs more commentary on a particular area in their museum, why not draw people from not necessarily the most obvious places to do that? Otherwise, you can script the artist to only being able to articulate from their own ethnic background, which is ridiculous. So I think, yeah, that's just sort of what I want to share, but I'm excited about that. And I'm also continuing my Smithsonian research fellowship, but unsanctioned. So I'm still, it's not over. And so I'm raiding their online database in their anthropology collection and erasing all the as many photos as I can find of the natives, Filipino natives in there. So they'll never see that, and it'll never really happen, but it's sort of my parallel version of their archive.
Yeah, and one of the kind of perks and dangers of the shift of everything to online and this period of like shifting, like, it is this kind of democratized access to collections, but what does that mean, and what can people do with them, and how can people, how can artists or individuals reimagine the boundaries between those collections and the public eye?
And also, I guess I just want to end too, and how to do that responsibly, right?
Yeah.
So the other thing is, as I'm going through these collections, I see incredibly problematic images. The last thing that I want to do is, without any form of actual critical intervention, I don't want to bring them back into the world, because what that does is it just it reiterates the original violence. And so, I think that for those of us working in this way, it's not enough to just bring it forward. There has to be a kind of humanization of things and an ability to not just show the damage that happened, but have some kind of like thoughtful uh, transformation.
Yeah, yeah, and I think by necessity, these institutions are going to have to transform to do the work that they need to do, that the people in a lot of these institutions really want them to do, and are trying to find the ways to make that happen. So I just want to thank you so much for bringing these conversations here today. I love the way your work blurs these boundaries between so many fields and so many issues that are incredibly important to everything that's going on around us right now. So I just want to say thank you for having this conversation. Thank you to everyone who attended today for bringing such great questions. We're seeing some thank yous in the chat. So wonderful to see our audience shouting back. I want to invite everyone to an event that we have coming up at the Hearst in a couple of weeks. I'll drop the link to that in the chat. And just let everyone know that the recording for this talk will be available in the future on the Hearst Museum's YouTube channel if you want to share it with anyone. So thank you, audience, for being here. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing everything today. And I'm so excited to see your future projects.
Yeah, me too. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.